Welcome to Broken Law, brought to you by the American Constitution Society, a 501c3 nonpartisan nonprofit organization. I'm Lindsay Langholz, Senior Director for Policy and Program at ACS. Today on the podcast, we're going to talk about the federal indictment of former President Donald Trump for his efforts in attempting to overturn the 2020 election. On Broken Law, we've talked extensively about the fallout from the 2020 election, including the January 6th insurrection and the continuing perpetuation of the big lie by election deniers across the country. Today, we are going to zoom in on a conversation that has emerged as the criminal case against the former president has entered a new phase, and that is claims that the First Amendment offers protection against charges of fraud, conspiracy to violate civil rights, obstruction of an official proceeding, and conspiracy to do so. Also, we know that these developments are not happening in a vacuum. In fact, the 2024 presidential election cycle is somehow well underway. We should take a second and see what's going on with these claims and also what impact they might have on the upcoming election cycles. To do that, we are so lucky to have Nora Benavidez joining us to help us take a look and make sense of all the First Amendment talk surrounding this particular case and take a look ahead as the cycle ramps up. Nora is Senior Counsel and Director of Digital Justice and Civil Rights at Free Press. There, she manages Free Press's efforts around platform and media accountability to defend against digital threats to democracy. Nora, we're so excited to have you. Welcome.
Oh, thank you, Lindsay. It's wonderful to be here. I'm a huge fan and I think a forever member of ACS. So
love to hear it. We're a huge fan of you too. And I couldn't think of anybody better to talk through this particular set of issues because you've just done so much work in this space. And so I wanted to do a little table setting first, but then dig in and really use your expertise to kind of help us make sense of this whole conversation and kind of what's going on. So former President Trump's attorneys have claimed that the criminal case against him is really about the First Amendment. I'm curious, what specifically in the First Amendment do they think provides protection, and what should we make of these claims? Are there any weight to any of them?
Sure. Well, I love every and any opportunity to talk about the First Amendment and the idea of what free speech means. I think Donald Trump also likes every opportunity to talk about free speech. He often uses it as a kind of shield for himself. He has a very long track record of saying kind of similar things, that something means he's entitled to exercise his free speech rights, or someone else might be, if they agree with him. And that's an important point that I hope we can talk about throughout the segment today, is the ways that he uses free speech, quote unquote free speech, as that shield. And it really gives him a free pass to do whatever he wants. So when I heard that his lawyers were saying that his free speech rights were being violated for what he did and said in the lead up to January 6th associated with those criminal charges, I honestly rolled my eyes because it just feels like so much of the same old that we've seen from Donald Trump as president and then following his presidency. I think it's important for us to be vigilant and take seriously when there are issues around government censorship, when something like what the government does to us does actually limit what we can say. Yeah. But I want to be really clear. This is not about what Donald Trump said or wrote. It's about what a former president did to undermine our democracy. And he has now said, and his lawyers have said, he has every right to say whatever he wants. Well, that's sort of what the idea of free speech seems to be when he describes it that way. It's not really. And I hope we can get into some of the legal and social political history of what the First Amendment means. But I think the short answer here is just, this president has a very long history of going after things he doesn't like. And he uses words to do that. He has removed journalists from press briefings because they asked questions he didn't like. He has gone after people on social media when they say things he doesn't like. But then he has a, get out of jail free card to do whatever he wants. And that's not how the First Amendment works.
And particularly the actions that he took while president, those were government actions, right? The First Amendment gets misunderstood in a lot of different spaces, but one of the ways it gets misunderstood is it's about government action to limit your freedom of speech. And so it's a really bizarre kind of claim to me as a relative novice in this space is how can you say as the government that you are being denied the ability to say these things when we all heard you say them? Like you had every ability to say the things that you were attempting to say. What is the difference there when it becomes a different kind of actor, when it's a government actor versus a private citizen?
Sure. I think back to the early printing press era when people started being able to express themselves and others were able to read and engage with what people were thinking and feeling. I look at the early British rule during this time, and so much of our conception in the United States of the First Amendment and the way the framers thought about the need for something like the First Amendment all flowed from issues in the UK right around that early printing press era. That was in the 1400s or so. And what became a kind of common practice was that manuscripts for publication were required to be submitted to crown officials, and they would approve or deny a license for the work so that it could or could not be printed. That was happening in the UK, and really it was a kind of censorship. Officials were able to pick and choose what was objectionable and then what was allowed. And what ended up happening, I think it sort of feels like the obvious, natural consequence here is that crown officials censored what was critical of the crown and of the king. And so one of the very first printers that was accused of trying to subvert the crown was someone named John Twynne. I know his name, and I always encourage everyone to know his name. He hadn't even published anything yet, but there was this rumor that his writings were really controversial. Government officials went to his home, they searched it, they took the proofs of the book, which were still like drying, hanging. And the papers suggested that a king, and the king at the time, should be accountable to the people. His story was very bleak. He was convicted and executed for that writing, which hadn't even been published yet. But that and what followed were many cases in the UK of early British crown censorship. And so when you then look at what the early US founding fathers were thinking about, it was all because of that history. Mm-hmm. And their question was, how do we make sure that the people have the opportunity and the freedom to speak their mind, to even think things? The writing that John Twynne did was in his home. Government officials invaded that space. Of course, that's also where we got some of the early ideas around the Fourth Amendment and our ability to be free from searches from the government. But the fundamental issue was, how do we make sure that we protect people's ability to speak? And how do we make sure that the government cannot then censor and intrude? Mm-hmm. So that's a long history lesson. I always love to give it, is the real truth, because I think it gives us so much insight into what Donald Trump has been doing, both as a former president and during his presidency. He used his power and authority as part of the government, as the highest leader in government, to pick and choose speech. At that time, that was clear government censorship. He would pick and choose what journalists he thought were willing were able to be in the press briefings. He would pick and choose different people that he thought should be allowed access to his government Twitter account, which was found an unconstitutional act. All of those were censorship tactics. He's now a former president. He is an everyday civilian, so to speak, a citizen, but using free speech as he does now as a kind of shield from accountability seems like more of that same old practice. And he is not just an everyday person. So it's really complicated, and it brings up very visceral questions, because I think it's a legitimate thing. People feel he should be allowed to say whatever he wants. But what I know we're going to get into, I hope today, is what is the impact of someone like Donald Trump when his words reach a boundary, a kind of bright line where that language clearly has very serious, dangerous consequence.
Well, I want to skip right to that because I think that that's what the heart of this conversation really is, right? Is this balance that basically he's kind of forcing into the conversation.
Yeah.
And so where is that boundary? When we talk about speech that impacts elections, that impacts the way that our democracy functions, where is that boundary where speech passes into a phase that can either be regulated or can be there can be action taken where it's not just like you can say whatever you want, go get them. How do we define that legally, and then also how should we be defining that if it's not the same?
That is a question that scholars, practitioners, lawmakers, and judges have been grappling with. The question is, where is the free speech breaking point? Is there a line? Should there be a line? And it really rises out of language where even thought that could be harmful or hateful or controversial. And once that is spoken, what happens to it? And what are the kinds of liabilities that should flow out of someone speaking those things? In the early 1900s, judges really wrestled with this. And what they came to sort of focus on was the idea of dangerous speech or dangerous ideas. And over time, we've actually seen our American First Amendment jurisprudence expand or kind of move the line of where free speech ends further and further out, actually. That's a really interesting takeaway, in my opinion, from the last 200 years, where at one time, cases like Shank really placed unacceptable or dangerous speech closer to us. And what we've seen in cases like Brandenburg, which is, I would say, for scholars and students listening, one of the seminal cases on First Amendment issues, we've really seen the Brandenburg v. Ohio case move what is acceptable further out. That is a significant departure from the line that had been drawn earlier in Shank. So what happened in Brandenburg v. Ohio, that was in the 1960s, and the Supreme Court eventually really grappled with how it considers First Amendment jurisprudence. The court held that speech which encourages illegal activity is only violative of the First Amendment if it incites imminent lawless action. And that's a phrase that I'm sure if you've been hearing a little bit about the Trump case or thinking about what's really going on, a lot of scholars talk about that. What is inciting imminent lawless action? And what we have seen is Donald Trump did a number of things and said a number of things in the lead up to the January 6th insurrection. There have been other cases involving people who participated, were actors in that attempt to overthrow and cut short the election certification process. And they all cited Donald Trump, saying that he inspired them. And so there's this question now of, did the words and the language that he used in the lead up to that attempt to cut the election certification short, did that incite imminent lawless action? And that's just a fascinating place for us to arrive at. And it's a really kind of horrifying place that a president in power would so believe and push forward lies that the election had been stolen, despite it being the most certified election we have seen in recent history, and then continue to push people to a breaking point where even they, as defendants in their own criminal cases, have said, we were inspired by what our president said, that the election had been stolen and we needed to take it back. But it's a difficult question to consider. Where does free speech end? Did he have the right to say that when he knew it was a lie? Did he have the right to say that? And should it be protected speech if, in fact, it inspired and incited others to take lawless action?
And one of the things that we're seeing in this case is the kind of speech plus, right? There was speech, there were words that he used in private, in public, and transmitted, spoken, but then there were actions that were taken. And I feel like in reading through the indictment, it struck me as the prosecution trying to get ahead a little bit of the First Amendment claims and saying, like, listen, if he was just talking, that's fine. But he wasn't. There were specific steps he took to enter into a conspiracy, to attempt to defraud the public. And I'm curious about specifically the fraud exception and how the fraud exception has come to play a huge role in this particular case because it's one of the charges levied against the president. But in theory, it's speech, right? If I'm just to put it in like more normal terms, if I go up to someone and say like, no, this will grow your hair back, and then sell them something to do so, is it the speech or is it the action that's taken, or is it a little bit of both?
A few years ago, what we're kind of circling around is what we have come to know as this sort of disinformation machine. The phenomenon that has really grown so big, it feels like it touches a lot of what we're talking about here. And that's why I brought up the issue of Trump's lies. The use of a fraud claim is really the legal mechanism to get at some of the ways that he has misrepresented and used words and actions to misrepresent a set of facts and circumstances around the election in 2020. But he also, and I feel like this is something I now am saying constantly on this podcast, he has a long history of doing that as well. The Washington Post had a really great timeline going for years that racked up all of Donald Trump's lies, all of the times he misrepresented things. He's not the only one that does this, and it's a kind of dangerous phenomenon I'm eager for us to talk about throughout the rest of the show. And the fraud claim is one that has been tested before with other defendants, conspiracy and fraud cases, or conspiracy to defraud, for example. These are claims that have been used in very careful ways by prosecutors here in the US to get at the people who are spreading lies intentionally to prevent voters from participating in the democratic process. And so it feels like kind of nascent ground for us because the issue of disinformation is relatively new in how prevalent it is, particularly its prevalence among leaders, its use by leaders like Donald Trump to inspire people and push them to take actions. And so it's an area of the law that we really need to be watching and very careful to make sure, is this the appropriate way to go after these types of problems? Here, it seems very carefully crafted in the indictment. And elsewhere, it's always important that we caution ourselves against using possibly dangerous claims around fraud to try to get at other things, which can frankly lead to government censorship. So it's a very, very fine line.
Yeah, no, absolutely. One of the engines behind the disinformation being so prevalent is social media. And, I was thinking of it as you were telling your story earlier of, pages hung up to be passed out or, now you hit a button and your message can be seen by basically the entire world. And if you have a huge platform, that's obviously amplified a lot. We saw after 2020, the January 6th Select Committee came out and said disinformation was absolutely fueled by social media platforms. And also people were able to organize the insurrection itself via social media platforms. As we grapple with accountability and making sure that folks are either held accountable or that we're changing things to make it safer going forward, where do we stand on that particular front, on the engine of disinformation? And what should we be maybe looking forward to as we kind of have an eye to 2024?
There's so much here in that question. So I guess let's start with the really simple things, which is one, We know that most Americans use social media as their number one first go-to place to get information, which means that the role that social media plays is really big in most of our lives. It's really a major part of how we understand issues, how we connect to people, what we see. And the reason that it's so difficult now is there has been a pretty concerted effort by social media platforms to say that they don't have a major role, that they are essentially these public squares, like they're the equivalent of a park, and that's it. But there's so much growing evidence around really what platforms know they are doing and the ways that they actually take proactive actions. I think the first general proposition we have to understand then, beyond just that Americans are using social media more than anything else, is that social media companies have a major role to play in the real world. There's so much evidence to support that. The ways that people are connecting, the information that they are seeing or not seeing, and more. And most of my work now at Free Press looks at these issues. How do we make the connection and hold accountable platforms in the real world? That they are not just neutral sort of park, openers, who like open the gate and then that's it. But these companies actually have an entire set of business models, algorithms, and various decisions internally they make that often do not make their feeds that people see neutral. There are a lot of ways we can go through that. The January 6th committee examined some of this, like you said. They even produced a draft report on social media. And they found in that draft report that former President Trump's supporters used Facebook very closely to track his claims about the stolen election, supposedly. And they used Facebook to track what his calls were for them to descend on DC and to protest on January 6th. The report found that Facebook's delayed response around this period helped facilitate the attack on January 6th. There have been other internal research reports that have come out and whistleblowers like Frances Haugen, who came out in 2021, citing some of the other internal Facebook concerns that were cited far earlier. Facebook, for example, now Meta, employed what was called a set of break glass measures in the lead up to 2020 election period in November. They employed that in what we think was around the October-November period. And then just right after the election occurred, they turned off those features. They were features that were supposed to carefully downgrade the visibility of content about the big lie and to also downgrade visibility or potential virality of extremist content around this issue of the election. So when they turned those features off right after the November election, that content that had kind of been like clamped down started surging more, and visibility of it by Trump's supporters also surged. That's part of what the January 6th committee looked at and what Facebook whistleblowers and researchers have tried to unearth and help come to light. So that's only one platform. There are a lot of other platforms in the mix.
Yeah.
And it's just one example illustrating that the kind of language on a platform can inform the tone and the temperature for our electorate. Very specific communities are targeted in the lead up to elections with disinformation, with claims that polling locations have closed near them. There are so many ways that people are targeted. And Donald Trump has used some of the vulnerabilities of platforms, the kind of ways that platforms craft their policies to make sure that his content is viewed, is liked, engaged with, etc. And there is an entire business industry that kind of undergirds the need for and the financial incentives for incendiary content to do really well.
You mentioned that Facebook is now Meta. There have been several changes since the 2020 election in terms of platforms and kind of what's out there. But specifically, what looms large for me is the change in policies and leadership at Twitter, X, whatever you feel comfortable calling it. And specifically, Elon Musk took over that company and with the point of he claims free speech, and he claims himself to be a free speech absolutist, and because of that has kind of unrolled some of those safety features that Twitter had that were maybe similar to the break glass policy at Facebook or Meta. What are you seeing and what are you looking at as we kind of enter into a new presidential election cycle with these changes that are being made, in some places really rolling back the safety features that we had in 2020?
I really want to get to the 2024 stuff because I know that that's so top of mind and important for us. I never want us to get to the point where we are in September, right before an election, and people say, we should start talking about elections and democracy. I somehow feel like it's all democracy. Like all of this is talking about how we engage and how we are part of democracy all the time. So I want to get to that part. And Musk is an important piece of this now, unfortunately. He exhibits a lot of Trumpian behaviors. To be honest, he has a pattern of silencing speech he doesn't like. And I won't go through all of them because it dates back way before Twitter or X. When he was at Tesla, he coordinated with the Chinese government to make sure that complaints about malfunctions in Tesla cars were limited on listservs. He also fired an employee who was critical of some of those malfunctions. And when he took over Twitter, even before he took it over, he had sort of announced the interest in doing it. And he said, I want to make sure that this platform is for everyone, all values and attitudes and beliefs. And then he took it over. He met with civil rights groups, including Free Press, made a number of assurances about the ways that he would protect the platform and users. And then flash forward to now, it's been a little over 8 months, and he's done a lot of things to erode Twitter's safeguards. They weren't even great before he took over, but he has, first of all, removed the board of directors, the Trust and Safety Council. He fired almost all of the trust and safety and moderation employees who were tasked with some of the most critical triaging of making sure that content that was violative actually had been taken action on. He removed responsible and ethical engineers looking at how design features could actually inform and protect users. He gutted so much of what Twitter had been and continues to promote really weird, dangerous, often partisan viewpoints. He reinstated accounts that had been previously suspended. Many of those were neo-Nazis, white supremacists. He has created this new blue checkmark, verification for pay. And the majority of people who have those are either bots or really toxic accounts. It's become, and then he rebranded as X, like that'll do away with all of our problems. He brought in a new CEO, and yet he has ultimately all control over how the platform functions. Even his new trust and safety committee and team that he's said he's creating is going to report to him. So I look at all of that and I'm like, okay, well, that's horrible for Twitter and for Twitter users, but what is the bigger ecosystem? What's happening? And the bad news is that negligence is mushrooming across other platforms. That's the sad truth. I kind of refer to this as the Great Retreat, that this negligence is not just happening at Twitter. YouTube recently reversed its election misinformation policy, suggesting in their press release that there's no meaningful impact when YouTube attempted previously to rein in lies about the 2020 election in the United States. TikTok has failed to permanently replace its head of trust and safety, who had left earlier this year. Threads has now been documented as a place where people are testing the boundaries of content moderation. Blue Sky fails to robustly moderate bigotry. And Meta is doing everything it can to kind of go on this, like, I don't know, press spree, saying that research now suggests that Meta is good for people and mental health, and it has no impact on polarization, that people are polarized anyway. And all of that together creates this very lacking, lazy set of social media platforms, which again is the number one way we all get information. And so I think it's given them license to see Elon Musk do less and less and get away with it. Other platforms are shirking their communication with users, their accountability, their moderating according to their own policies that they've written, and then going so far as to change their policies to roll those back. That great retreat is really dangerous for our democracy as I look towards 2024. That's the stuff that I'm the most worried about. That this is a moment when platforms should be doing more to ramp up the ways that they are hiring people, training people, making sure their algorithms are appropriately spotting violative content. But instead of ramping things up, they are rolling things back. And that means that when it comes to election lies or other falsehoods that are left unchecked on platforms, I really believe it's going to be voters that suffer.
It's August of 2023. So I'm glad that we're having this conversation now instead of, as you said, waiting to September 2024. Are there policies, are there things that can be done to rein in some of this rollback? I'm doubling down on the I guess a double negative makes a positive. But are there things that can be done to try and stop this slide backwards, so that we're in a better place as we go into kind of the heart of an election cycle, to deal with this misinformation that is certainly not going away? We're seeing more sophistication with deep fakes, with just basic, telling people where their polling locations is incorrect. Like all spectrum of disinformation is now kind of on the table. Are there ways that we can get ahead of it now, as a collective? And are there questions that we should be asking of these companies as we're going into this cycle?
Ahead of 2022, the midterms last year, I worked with a number of coalitions, civil and human rights organizations, through a coalition called Change the Terms. It's a really big umbrella. And we wrote to all of the major social media platforms with a set of questions about what were they planning to do ahead of the midterms. We know that election disinformation is actually not seasonal. It happens all the time. It does go up before elections, but it's always on platforms. We also know that these companies aren't really doing enough. And so we presented a lot of this evidence to the platforms. Scheduling meetings was difficult even as a first step. And we worked with, and there's been some really excellent media coverage from last fall around the ways that the platforms were so obviously not doing enough. I see less and less critical reporting about the platforms. And they have a lot of money to spend on good PR. Meta has done a great job of spinning a number of research studies to their benefit. And so I think one of the things, however corny it sounds, we really do need people to be more educated and more critical of what the platform's role is, to show and to really shine a light on the fact that they are not doing enough. In the lead up to 2024, they can't lackadaisically take stock and announce a set of plans in August or September like they often do. Yeah. TikTok's plan for the 2022 midterms were almost a complete copy and paste of their 2020 plans. YouTube's were similarly almost a copy and paste. And they make it very difficult for people on the outside to know what's happening. So we need more understanding and more awareness of what the company's plans are. That's a lot of the work that I'm going to be doing over the coming months with allies in the civil rights space. We call it the digital civil rights space because all of this is happening online. And it's important that people are aware of these problems, that much of the toxicity, the division is really flowing from a set of decisions that these companies make, a kind of washing of their hands in the situation. I think there's another area, though, without getting too wonky, that we do need to talk about. Part of why it's so easy for people to be targeted online with laser-like precision, with disinformation, hate, harassment, is because of the data that's collected about us. And that is rampant across platforms and other digital services. And we've seen that companies are loath to do very much that would actually make users' experiences safer and help keep free expression neutral and alive. That really points to the need for other interventions. And that's another piece of what I think we have to understand now, that our data is used to minimize the empowerment and the authority that we have in our digital experiences. And knowing the way that this online world now absolutely impacts, informs our offline experiences, we have to understand that data is an essential part of it. It sometimes sounds boring, is the real truth. Like our data is important. We often like the idea that our data could help give us better recommendations online, but it's actually a tool for companies to keep gathering stuff, make money off of us with advertising revenue, and remove us from being active players in our lives and in democracy. So I'm really eager over the coming months to continue pushing for the ways that regulatory and policy reforms have to address and safeguard our data privacy. That is essential far before we get to an election. It's one of the most long-term ways, I think, that we will see limits on some of the most dangerous online practices.
Yeah, to me, oftentimes when I'm having conversations about data, it kind of comes across as people being like, oh, it knows that I like videos about dachshunds, so it just shows me more dachshunds. And it's like, yes, that's part of it. But there's also a reason that your uncle, we all have the uncle who's on Facebook who keeps getting served this content, is in that audience. And it's not just because, oh, he happened across like 5 different articles that he read more and more. It's like it is serving that information to him based on his data and based on targeting.
It is. And it's a hard problem to share and make obvious or even urgent for people, because it sort of feels removed from those problems we discussed earlier. Like, how is the data collected about me or you relevant to Donald Trump saying he has the free speech right to say whatever he wants around this criminal case? Mm-hmm. That's a really long thread to needle, or needle the thread. It's really, really hard. And it's important to do it over and over, to really make the connection that civil rights issues, the ways that we engage with each other, and frankly, the autonomy, the empowerment that we would have as everyday people to exercise our free speech rights, all flow from the things that the platforms and other companies do online to us. Mm-hmm. They speak to each other. They share data across platforms. They even sell data to our government. The FBI, DHS, other agencies regularly buy data about us to target dissent, racial justice movements. There is a long history of the ways that our US government has gotten data about us to target things like the civil rights movement and, throughout history, a kind of progressive set of voices. And I know that ACS is so interested and focused and wonderful in the ways that we are pushing for better, broader civic engagement around democracy. It all flows back now to this weird digital era that we live in.
Well, and because, as you mentioned earlier, so many of the ways we interact with our democracy are now online. It's not just, oh, someone reminded me to vote online. It's, I get my news from there, and then I see what my friends are talking about. And then we're interacting with our own democracy through a screen in a lot of ways. And so it's being filtered in ways that we may not even understand, and it's important to try and understand those ways.
Yeah. We're not going to be without a long list that bad actors have of the tools to subvert and make us feel like our votes won't matter. You mentioned some of the newer, more nascent issues. I mean, AI will absolutely be used. Large machine learning tools will craft journalistic news articles that are not written by a human with fake news sources. And that'll then, with laser like precision, be targeting people on platforms. That's just one of the things that bad actors will use. It's certainly not the only. We've had so many election cycles now where disinformation and fear mongering create apathy, disinterest from voters in the democratic process. And this big list of things that forms of manipulation that bad actors have at their disposal is just growing. So what we need to do is make sure that we are aware of what those potential manipulations are, and to remind people the election is critical, the election is coming, election results won't come on election day, your vote matters. There's some of the most basic things, but we have to go back to that again. And we have to encourage journalists to go back to it, our elected officials to go back to it. It's really a kind of drumbeat that we have to hit, that those civil rights protections have to happen all the time, and we have to engage in them.
I know we're running short of time. I want to ask on that particular point before we wrap up. Are there ways that folks can be increasing their own digital literacy, understanding when misinformation is coming their way, best practices of maybe like when to share, when not to share? Are there things that folks who are listening can do themselves? Because a lot of this that we've discussed is important, and pressure on companies and legislators is important, but sometimes it can feel a little disempowering of like, well, I don't know, this is all happening to me. I don't really have any way of engaging with it. And so I'm curious if there are ways that folks can at least engage with it in their own communities.
Well, let's say the simplest thing that we can do, because frankly, there are so many things we can learn to do, all of us, to become more literate, more savvy. But the number one thing is there is a moment for each of us when we are on platforms, when we're on a social media site, we want to share something for a number of reasons that really relate to like our own brains and psychology. Something looks enticing and we want to get in on it. And the number one thing I encourage is in that moment, we have to train ourselves before we publish, before we post, before we share, to take at least 10 seconds to think about what you're looking at. I know that seems really small. Why are you recommending we just take a pause? But I think if we all did that, if we looked at what we were actually seeing and moved from a kind of passive consumption to really actively considering what's in front of us, we would slowly begin to not grow more suspicious, but to think about, I trust Lindsay and Lindsay shared this, but maybe Lindsay was busy and didn't have time to fact check it. Or I would see an image of the Pope in a puffy jacket and I would say, I'm not sure the Pope would wear that in April or May. If I slowed down, I might be able to ask myself, let me scroll up to the top of this article. Oh, it says sponsored. Maybe it isn't something that I should be seeing, but I'm being recommended this. That 10 seconds or so can be really important and can make the difference between us believing and sharing and passively just continuing to help with a quiet deluge of bad content, and really take back our experiences online. There are so many other ways that people can become digitally literate, and organizations that do great work. I used to work at an organization called PEN America, and we launched a media literacy and disinformation defense program, which does amazing work. Pointer has an amazing entity, MediaWise, which also looks at how do you fact check information. And then there are other non-English language fact-checking entities that also do really good work. We haven't really talked about, and I know we don't have time to talk about, the non-English disinformation that thrives, that targets voters. But that is a very real threat facing voters come 2024, and we've seen it previously. So there are some really great entities like Fact Chequeando, Ekis Labs. All of these are really holding the line to help people carefully understand what they're consuming and to be more active in that consumption.
Those are great. Thank you. And we will make sure to include some links in the show notes too, so that folks can find them easily. So no need to go and rewind and write them all down. We'll put those in the show notes. I want to end on a question that we love to ask here, which is there anything that folks can do at home or where they can learn more, where listeners can basically take the next step? They've got their 10-second rule now. They're going to do it. Is there anything that they can be taking an action with or doing something to kind of help as we get ready for the 2024 cycle, but also as we continue to see the criminal trial play out and news developments come out of that as well?
Listen to the podcast and share it with people is the first thing.
Love that.
Talk about these issues. We have such a shallow sense of the way we all communicate with each other. We're moving fast. We share things in those little clips, little tiny character accounts. So engaging with these issues is always number one. But in more concrete ways, because I know we're all hungry to sign a petition or do something. I've been working, as I mentioned, on ways that policies can protect digital civil rights. And the biggest thing we are doing at Free Press and with a number of organizations is a campaign called Hands Off My Data, which is an effort to bring real people into the debate about why we need to protect digital civil rights. So I will share and make sure that ACS has that link in the website when you publish the podcast. And I hope that people will join that effort. We need people talking about the election now and the role that different sectors have. So my final request is talk with people about platforms, talk about the role that platforms should have and that they need to be doing more to protect us. Thank you so much, Lindsay.
Oh my goodness, Nora, thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you to our listeners for finding Broken Law. Please be sure to follow and subscribe so you don't miss an episode. It is summer, so if you find yourself on a long car ride or plane ride or wherever you're headed and want to go back, we have a full catalog. So please go back and listen wherever you listen to your podcasts and are listening to this. If you're enjoying the show, help us bring it to more listeners by giving us a 5-star review and recommending Broken Law to a friend. Together, we will speak truth to power about the law, whose interest it really serves and whose it does not.